So, static interviews. You may not know what a static interview is. It's a normal interview face-to-face where the participants aren't moving much. All right, so with conducting static interviews, what does that look like? Well, you'll be taking your interview protocol with your canonical genre selection, and you'll be sequencing these in time. You're creating what's called a macro genre, just basically a collection of genres, one or more for every question that you're asking. And you'll be producing some bridging language which will join these up. That's what an interview looks like from this perspective. A set of probes which issue information packaged up into facts or stories organised in time. And along with this basic template for an interview, when I started to write this book, I started to realise that there were actually a whole bunch of practices which the interviewer is doing, and I started to go catalogue those as I was seeing them. The first was, of course, genre bridging. How we move from one genre to another is actually a skill. How it looks like we are actually interviewing smoothly is a real art, and that's what genre bridging is about. It's the opportunity of the interviewer to dance from one question to another in a form that makes sense for the interviewee, often. Sometimes between questions there's quite lengthy stretches of language in real transcripts, and often what's going on is that for semi-structured and unstructured interviews at least, we've got interviewers who have domain knowledge themselves and interviewees that have domain knowledge themselves. And often I've seen with these corporate interviews a kind of dance between the interviewer and interviewee because they're both very knowledgeable. And what they're doing is actually negotiating the next bit of information. It's not something that you can plan for, it's something that is enacted in the process of doing the interviewing. And so I saw quite a lot of examples of this because the corpus of interviews I was using were really about maintenance deferral in software systems, which is a very specific kind of technical skill. Both the interviewee and the interviewer had this skill. And so at times they literally negotiated the next question. It was beautiful to see. Very complicated, and I've never read anything about this. There are also clarifications. Clarifications are when we realign the interviewee back to a specific genre element. So this is not working at the level of a genre, it's working at a particular element. Again, another feature that was evident in the interviews I was looking at, but I've never read this at all in any interviewing text. So this is to be contrasted with a realign, which I've talked about before. Another set of practices I saw were goading. I called it goading. And that's really when you're trying to get somebody to talk, particularly within a particular genre element. And one strategy I noticed that the interviewer who was doing these interviews for me was basically interjecting in the answer that was coming from and in effect create a kind of virtual turn in the conversation. So they basically more or less trick, that's not quite the term, but what they use turn-taking conventions where the obligation then is back onto the interviewee to continue to talk. I sort of looked at this and went, never seen that either in any interviewing texts whatsoever. And along with this are formulaic expressions that we can use to keep the interviewee talking. And those are typically called conversational routines, but these are I've referred to as continuation routines. Finally, other practices that I saw included reprobes. That's issuing a new probe for a different canonical genre during the interview. So the interviewer changes their mind, reissues a different probe, and then we're on to a different canonical structure. Reprises, knowing more than one way to ask a particular question. So we might probe for a particular genre in different ways. It may not be answered the first time. We may be able to issue a new probe, and that produces the desired result. So I started developing this kind of idea. Canonical genres, that's the narrative and factual genre family, together with their textual strategies, plus enactment practices. These were the things that I actually saw for static interviews. Gives me this approach to elicitation strategies. And I thought, oh, that's really good. And so because I have this kind of structure of, I know what kind of question should invoke a particular kind of genre, then what I can do is actually create a kind of a template for any kind of question. It involves probing for a particular genre, maybe a second probe as a follow-up question if it wasn't completely answered. On occasion, I may need to reprise the probe to recover the genre that I want. If I have problems of completeness, then I issue a repair, the associated repair. If I have problems with the relevance of the answer, then I can realign. And then I have these textual, practices, including clarifications, goading, continuation routines, generic bridging, dynamic reworking and reprobes to assist in the process of getting a coherent response from the interviewee. We know about static interviews. Goalong interviews are a little bit more unusual. Goalong interviews are when we're moving through a space. And the space itself suggests topics, perhaps, of conversation. And these are actually extremely important for areas like place marketing, for example. We have to move through a physical space. It's based on a kind of, my view of this is from a communication point of view, is it's based on a distinction that was developed by a guy called Anderson, Peter B. Anderson, who was one of my examiners for my PhD, a brilliant Danish semiotician. And he said, well, you've got a problem in situations where you have no language. Sort of obvious, right? And the solution to this is to probe, is to actually ask a question, right? So he developed this notion of an empty corpus problem, and I built this out. I don't expect you to be able to read this. But basically what it says is that there are a number of situations. If I am faced moving into a space with people in it where there's no communication going on, just like here, then I would have to ask somebody for a question. If I could, I would transform that situation into one where there is language going on that is somehow indirect. It's not about what I'm talking about, it's about what you'll be responding to. And then I've got a range of methods I can use. But some situations, there's nobody I can ask, there's no thing I can interrogate, I can't actually interview. In which case, I can observe if there's any kind of action and activity going on, or I could reconstruct. So in my thesis, I reconstructed the social dimensions of an information system from the code that was used to implement the business process that I was interested in. So I won't explain much further than that, but they're all the methods I could use at that time. So I now have enactment practices for both interviews and Goalong interviews. It works out that everything I can do statically, I can apply with a Goalong interview. So that's an unusual property.